Hi, welcome to History Mostly Ancient Discussions. I'm Richard Sassoon. Your co-host, Aaron De Los Reyes, is going to lead us through this tour of what has been happening in Ukraine since we last spoke right after Prigozhin was starting up his little attempted coup. I don't know what we want to call his little upstart rebellion. But in the last few months, there have been a number of changes on the Ukraine front. Slow and imperceptible ones, but they have existed. And so we're going to discuss those. But for those of you who are unfamiliar, we are History Mostly Ancient Discussions. We have all kinds of meetings, and you can find out about those if you join our meetup group. You can see our previous meetings, including my Middle Eastern history series that recently wrapped up at our YouTube channel. You can also see the other 9 episodes in this Ukraine series to sort of take you through from the invasion in early 2022 to now. And of course, if you like what you're seeing and you think that we're doing a great job, our PayPal link is down below. So that way you can help us keep the lights on for premium Zoom, premium Meetup, and premium YouTube. All right, Aaron, these are all of your sources for a number of the material, right?
Yes, they are. Can you hear me okay? I just want to double check.
We can.
Okay, there's no background noise or anything?
No, we're good.
Okay, good. Yep, so this is the background information. Just want to always give people credit for all the great support that we've been able to acquire information from. I always like to validate all of the fantastic research. There's a whole world of research out there that's really been developed over the last 18, 19 months, really just kind of out of left field, thousands of people, both through social media and the existing institutions that have basically adapted to the new, to this new war and to this new world order. On to the next slide. Sure. So we have a couple of links here, which Richard, if you don't mind clicking, just to give people these are safe links also. Yep, to just give people a sort of a view of the war. This is the agenda that I wanted to cover today, just to cover the Russian mobilization, energy update, and some
just
what's really been. Oh, go ahead.
Can you see the Ukraine control map, or you're still seeing the PowerPoint presentation?
I'm still seeing the PowerPoint.
Okay, so let me
because you're full screen. Yeah. Yep, there we go. All right, get me off video. So all of you can get access to this. So we'll have the links. If you don't mind, Richard, just putting the links into the chat. And then you can really kind of click what you're interested in, different geolocations. So this is data that's been updated. I mean, at this point, there's, probably more, at least thousands of people who are updating this, and there's a pretty strong validation. It's almost like really strong open source software code, basically, but for mapping, given all the different social updates that people have done by, when they take a picture of something, you can geolocate it on a map, you can you can time slice it, etc. So at this point, I would say this has as strong of a validation as almost anything you're going to get in the open source, non-secure, non-governmental community.
So wait, so sort of 2 questions on this.
Sure.
So this is entirely created by civilians. This is not created by the military apparatus of the various countries.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is it's 90%. I would say that people, especially in this war, have a very strong set of relationships, right? So you might have Ukrainian analysts that are not official government ones, but they have 25 relatives fighting in the war, and the same on the Russian side. So or friends, family, etc., ex-colleagues. And so you do have almost, I would say maybe a I'm just making up these numbers, but let's say a 20% overlap, just because they can validate. I mean, you're not going to have whole divisions of forces, not on the map, or probably even regiments not on the map. So where it would probably get pretty gray is when you start getting smaller than regiment. That's
And the
where
other
that
question is sort of,
mobility.
what are we
Sure.
looking at in particular? Like, what are the
You,
different symbols generally
yeah,
mean?
you're looking at the densest combat line since the Iran-Iraq War,
Yeah.
is what you're looking at here. So you're looking at, a better part of 500,000 on both sides combined, at least. I'd safely say that, and maybe even at some points a little more, spread over a front of around 600-700 kilometers. So, this is we've talked about this before in prior presentations, but the scale of the density and mass of this fight is truly unparalleled in the modern world since the Iran-Iraq War, even the Gulf War, which I think people have a parallel to. One thing that was never really discussed by most people is the ratio of forces. And when you're looking at hard combat arms, I mean the UN, uh, Saudi and Kuwait supported allies had basically a 5-to-1 ratio. So, for every roughly 100,000 heavy combat arms that the Iraqis had, the Allies had about 500,000. So this is a lot different because you have much more of a 1-to-1 ratio, or maybe 3-to-2 ratio. And so it's just astronomical density. So you're just not going to see huge breakthroughs for obvious reasons, because you can always when something comes through, whatever side it comes through, you can always reinforce, right? You have additional resources. Um, so, and one of the things that I encourage people to do is, drill through these types of maps. I put 2 in there. I can put a few others in the future, in the meetup YouTube channel, and be able to just start drilling in to look at particular areas like the separatist line. I mean, I'd say one thing that's really important to understand. There's been this debate, which is a is sort of the Ukrainian view, which is we have to protect everything, which we talked about well over a year ago, which is really having 5 fronts. And then there's this concept in operations, which is modern concept the U.S. and NATO allies have, which concentrates forces on a particular target for mass scale, large scale breaching and maneuverability and penetration to the rear. And the Ukrainians have not taken that approach. And I do believe there's a frustration in there built in, because and I get it at a political level, right? You don't want to see territory because there's obviously a natural sensitivity, given this is a war of basically existential survival. But when you have finite resources, and more importantly, you have an enemy that is basically a peer enemy of the land, it's almost impossible if you attack it all similar type of fronts, even if it's not simultaneous, to be able to actually have any type of significant penetration. And so that's really been, I think, the shift that the U.S. and the NATO allies are really encouraging. If I had to make a big guess of the recent visits to the U.S., while obviously a lot of this is political and maintaining political support, and some of it the big shift around F-16 and ATACMs, which we'll discuss also. I believe behind the scenes, a lot of this is about supporting and attempting to get Ukrainian high command to evolve their approach. And we heard about different dismissals of senior commanders and or Ministry of Defense individuals, and I'm sure some of that was built around inefficiency, corruption, and so on. I'm sure a big piece of it was the approach to the fight, and I believe as a predicate of the U.S. Giving F-16 precision guided munition as the Allies doing the same, there is, in essence, a requirement to shift into a much more modern approach to defending. It's really not about defending Ukrainian territory at that point. It's really about developing, breaching into the rear of the Russian forces and generating huge amounts of vulnerability and weaknesses in them to take advantage. And that's a really big philosophical approach.
I
Go
was going
ahead,
to say,
please.
can
Yeah,
you concretize a little bit about this
yeah,
difference? Because I can
sure.
understand the territorial defense, right? The territorial
Yep,
defense is this idea of every inch of Ukrainian soil needs to be protected. So we're going to create a front that is the entire length from border to
that's right.
border so the Russians can't penetrate. But what is this kind of philosophical difference that you're talking about?
Yeah.
Are we
So the
talking about
philosophical difference can be you actually wind up ceding territory at various stages, which will only increase stresses on the Russian forces and on their supply lines. Because when you attack, especially in mass, we're not talking about, a couple dozen, 100 people, we're talking thousands, tens of thousands. When you move that many people over a stretched area, and we're looking at a front here that's well over 1,000 kilometers, um, you have enormous stresses on those supply lines, on sustaining that. I mean, it's really easy to say, oh, we have this village now. Okay, great. How are people eating? Where's their water coming from? Where's their fuel, their generators? The fuel isn't just for vehicles, it's for generations. If you want communications equipment to work, you need power. And so your ability to say, fine, we'll cede these absolutely secondary, tertiary, you know, non-relevant objectives to create more mass density, right? To bring dozens of brigades and regiments into a concentrated area like Zaporizhzhia, right? Like if the Ukrainians could penetrate there with enormous force, right? Because it's not just about the breaching, which we'll get into. I have a few slides on that. It's about sustaining that once you do, and typically the only way to sustain that is you bring that same density that you had to defend yourself through that breaching operation. So if it required you 6 brigades to defend the territory, when you come through, you better have really close to 6 brigades to defend the breach. Well, to do that, you need to have maybe twice that many, 12, and that's just to defend what you had and to defend the breach. That's not to actually have the offensive side of that operation. That might be another 12. So when you start looking at those numbers, if you can conduct an operation of that scale, and if you look at its strategic impact, by doing that, you would trap all those southern Russian forces, including forces in Crimea, if you look on the map, which obviously the Russians would likely not surrender. They would have a very hasty retreat, as fast as they could, but it would generate an absolute strategic shift in the fight, because it would force the Russians to have to completely shift the balance of the fight, and the scale of the war at this point.
Aaron, can I
And
ask
yeah,
you a
go ahead,
question?
please.
One thing, if I understand correctly, because maybe it'll benefit our listeners as well. You're suggesting that by ceding territory, the Russians would have to open up their defenses, to go through, and that would be a way to get in. Is that right?
Well, yeah. So imagine you cede certain parts of the far northern, and typically when you do this, you're not just ceding a whole swath of territory, right? It's this very sort of hot spot, right? You give up a little ground in small areas that are very unstrategic, and you see if they take the bait, right? I mean, this is the animal kingdom, basically, right? It's
because they would
strategy.
open their defense, which
That's right.
they have.
That's exactly right. And also they would be out in the open with defensive forces, right? So if you think of the type of Russian, the composition of the Russian fighter now, the majority of them, given their cycles of rotations, you're dealing with a force that's been trained on the front line as a defensive fixed fortification force. Now you're saying go out in the open and take 10 kilometers in front of you. Okay, well, to me, that looks like a whole bunch of, ants as a target with a bunch of water at that point. And it gives you an opportunity, if you're Ukraine, to pick off, obviously, Russian small and medium-sized Russian units, but more importantly, it puts pressure on the Russian command staff locally and at an intermediate level, across the echelons. And so as you start putting pressure on the Russians to make decisions, right? That's what this strategy really is always about. It's about creating a decision science on your enemy, where right now when you're in this fixed fortification defense, to be honest, it's like Groundhog Day. I mean, you can just teach people to do the same thing over and over and over again.
I have another question.
Wait,
Sure.
wait, Greg, if I could
Oh, sure.
clarify also, imagine if you have 4 different positions with 3 people on each position. If what Aaron says, if we take Aaron's strategy, we take one position and we open it up, then instead of having 3 people at each position, they now have 2 people at those other 3 positions, and they've taken one person off to go into the breach.
That's right.
So that combined with the fact that these people are now outside of their defensive fortifications, which means that it's much easier to shoot them down. All those other 3 positions are less well defended. So that's sort of the idea.
Yeah, and so when you combine all this together, now once again, this is not trivial and easy to do. Obviously, the amount of synchronization, planning, all the way down the echelons is what makes this difficult and complicated. And obviously, the Ukrainians have been somewhere between not confident in doing this or not believing that it makes sense to do. And I would say at the same time, very, very, restricted capabilities that they don't believe they can synchronize and synthesize. And so the real shift, I believe, as the US and the allies are bringing 4th generation fighters and most advanced precision guided munitions, plus obviously most advanced surveillance and targeting technology. So we're getting to that phase where Ukraine is going to be getting the whole NATO kit, basically. And the cost and value of that kit is somewhat precious, right? You're not regenerating that kit. These aren't 7.62 rounds, right? For AK-47s, these aren't, mortar or small artillery rounds. This is really the modern generation of military technology since the 80s, 90s to the 2000s. So I believe, and this is just my belief, is that there's a predicate here that the Ukrainians are going to have to shift their approach so that they're not stuck in this permanent defensive fixed lines, which also at a strategic level, like at a political macro level, will ultimately equal to a frozen conflict. I think everybody is aware of that. And so the Ukrainians are going to have to make some moves. And of course, the Russians are aware of this. It's the game theory going on right now. And the longer you wait, or the more careful you try to be after a certain point,
The more
you
occupied
want
the
to be
position
careful.
is.
Exactly. I mean, in the first few months, do you want to be careful? Sure. After 6, 9, 12 months, careful actually equals bad because you ossify these positions. That's exactly right. And also your enemy gets smarter. I mean, not just about what you're doing, but about what they're doing, and they will less likely take that bait because they'll sit there and say, "Nah, you don't want it. I don't want it either." And and you just don't get people out into those fights. And given the fact that the force, and this is all tied to force generation, right? I mean, the Ukrainians aren't going to magically generate another 100,000 or 200,000 people overnight. They're going to do that over, 12 months to 18 months. And the Russians, outside of their conscript cycles, are not going to magically generate another 100 or 200,000 very capable forces. So they're both almost locked into these force regeneration cycles. And so if you don't change something and you have fixed lines, force regeneration the same way, and all you're doing is amping up the technology, well, then you will get to a frozen conflict because you'll just run out of all the resources that are likely applicable to make a difference. Because if you're fixed, throwing, more advanced weapons actually is not very efficient at a return on investment perspective.
Sorry, Greg,
so
what was
Aaron,
your second question?
Yeah. Can I ask my second question?
Sure.
And it's really something I don't understand. That's regarding the F-16.
Yep.
First of all, my understanding that F-16s are not necessarily better than top Russian airplanes. That's one. The second one is that the Russians have maybe 1,000 planes more than Ukrainians, and how 20 or 30 F-16s could change the battle. I just cannot understand.
So if you, Richard, if you want to go to I have some F-16 slides, just go through the slides real quick. And you can just scroll down there. And we don't have, like I said, we don't have to do this in any kind of, magical order. It's much more fun when we're doing the Q&A and going through this. So
I'm trying to find your F-16 slide. What?
Oh, you'll see it. It's right. It says a UA Air Force upgrade, F-16 Vipers. It's slide 12.
Got it. Okay, so I was actually looking for planes.
Yeah. I didn't put a bunch of graphics in there because everyone can do those searches.
Yeah.
So if you can pull that up on the screen. Yep, thanks. So what I did here is just a really simple sort of view. Everyone can go to Wikipedia. Everyone can go see a bunch of videos. But this is sort of a summary. Obviously, these are sort of we'll call it the four big inputs here. So the F-16s, which are also called Vipers, that's what the pilots have called them over the last 30 plus 40 years. A couple of things to understand what the F-16s are and why they even exist. There was a group of pretty radical pilots in the United States Air Force in the 1960s. They were called the Air Force Mafia, and it was a group of sort of new generation, all physics and electrical engineering, mechanical engineering trained pilots who saw the approach that the Defense Department was taking, not just the Vietnam War, but just overall, and who they understood the threats to be from the Soviets and where they were going to, as being a mismatch. And so they basically developed from the ground up this concept of extremely high maneuverable, very lightweight. Think of it as basically a light airframe, a whole bunch of weapon systems attached to a gargantuan engine. That's basically the simple way to look at it. And what it does through its evolution, through its these type of weapon systems, they call them blocks. So as they come out with each new generation, it's a block. So as they've gone through all the block generations, they standardized, simplified, and integrated more and more. So the F-16 can carry more weapons, really any platform in history. It can carry up to 180 different weapons. So anything in the NATO kit that's ever basically been duct taped to the bottom of an airframe can basically be put on an F-16 in one of the pods. The pilot training, because it's an export platform that's well over a dozen countries, it has the most extensive non-flying training, which is really the key when you're developing pilots. It costs a fortune to put them actually in the cockpit and fly them. A lot cheaper to have simulators, and so they have these amazing simulators, which are like going to a fancy video game, parlor that has all the large video game systems that you sit in and like ride. But it's capturing all that telemetry, all that data, and there's different generations of that. So think of it as like the one you would teach college students that are engineers and basic pilot trained, and then the ones you teach people with a year or two experience, and the ones you teach with 2 to 5, 6 years. So they have like 3 of these simulators, which all they're doing is giving you nearly, it's like 98% the same experience. And then they have built a ground crew version of the same thing. So literally imagine a hangar with a whole bunch of combination of real and simulated artifacts of the F-16, and the ground crew goes through that type of training. So it's almost like architecture school, really, like for anyone that has a background in how how modern architecture school teaches people through models and molds and small, medium, big, and then the real project. What's really important is I wanted to present that first to give you a sense of the scalability, right? So once you can get that sort of pipeline, assembly line, conveyor belt going, their ability to scale, very much like you've seen these ground-based weapon systems, is there. Now, the second thing is the amount of these. The U.S. has about 1,000. The Allies have a better part of 300-400. So there's more than enough out there. And so it's really a question of aligning the Ukrainians to, the scaling, and then obviously giving them access to them. So then we get to the questions that Greg has. So the weapons they carry, and I listed sort of the dominant weapons here. So the AIM 7, 9, and 120 give you pretty much all of the major standoff attacking capabilities where you can hit any type of anti-air, any type of other air assets. And then the bottom three are your long-range munitions or heavy munitions that allow you to hit ships. That's a Harpoon, AGM-88. Think of this like basically a small ballistic missile that lets you hit a long-range target. So they give you more than enough weapons. These things are highly maneuverable, and they give you a training platform. Now, who cares? Right? That's the bigger question. Well, the who cares part of it is their ability to concentrate them in a corridor. So where F-16s really work, and this is going to be a test for the Ukrainians, is you don't use them onesie twosies, right? You use them in groups of 4, 6, 8, and more even. And so building sort of small squadrons of 12, 15, 18, the full squadron is typically 25 or 30 in the West. And then building up to these large squadrons or a whole wing of 50 or 60 through 24, and then maybe twice that many in 25, would allow them to build, think of it as almost carving these big channels or corridors, which would generate huge costs for the Russians to counter. 50 of them, as Greg pointed out, would not make a difference across a 1,000-kilometer line. You'd probably take 500 to do that. But you can, if you concentrate your resources, and then pointed out the U.S. approving the ATACMS, which the ATACMS in a strange way are like a ground missile version of the F-16. It's basically a ballistic missile that you plug right into a Himmler's firing solution, which is the ground-based mobile firing system. So imagine like a great big pickup truck, with a big, huge box on the top of it. And today you can put 4 or 6 regular missiles on it, or rocket systems, or you could put one of these ATACMS on it. So when you combine these 2 new systems together and a potentially targeted Ukrainian strategy to sever or split some massive group of forces that the Russians have, that is likely the shift in the approach that either Ukraine is going to have to take, or it's going to be dependent on our advanced support of Ukraine. And I separate advanced from existing support, right? Advanced support is giving them these platforms that cost everything in these platforms is hundreds of thousands to millions to tens of millions. This is really expensive kit. And then the training and the ground crews. So the other thing to realize about F-16s is for every hour of flight, it's 17 hours of maintenance for a whole ground crew. Not 17 total hours, but 17 hours of maintenance. So you're not really doing more than a sortie a day, maybe 2 a day if opportunities abound, or there's a crisis. But you're not doing 5 sorties a day in one of these. I mean, you could theoretically do that, but you're gonna have challenges a month or 2 later, right? So, there's always trade-offs. If you're going to be able to carry all these weapons and you can have all this maneuverability, you have this massive engine on it, you have a hell of a lot of maintenance that you have to do. Now, last piece that makes this an incredible platform is that there's a special helmet. It's think of it as like a integrated helmet that allows a pilot that when they turn, it's integrated into the systems and that they don't have to actually maneuver in the cockpit. It does most of the maneuvering for them. So this helmet, which this helmet costs nearly $1 million plus the training and support for it, is the heads-up display integrated helmet system that the Ukrainians are going to have. So this is a radical shift in the combat technology that the Ukrainians are going to have over the next year, even with 50 of them. And obviously, the best Ukrainian pilots are going to be the first ones trained. Let's say their best 50 or 100. The other thing is you don't need as large of a team to support this. So when you put all this together, I do believe by next summer, the Ukrainians will have a very strong targeted capability in the air. And that's going to put pressure on the Russians, because so far the Russians have not had to really have an air contestation campaign. It's been all this anti-air, shoulder fired air, and both sides are going to have to deal with this now, which is going to mean you're going to be bringing anti-air technology closer to the front. It's going to expose more targets on both sides. I mean, this is going to be a shift in both sides over the next year because of the air.
Now, how will this fit into sort of Russia's style of drone warfare that we've seen, right? Because it seems like Russia has sort of ceded the airspace to drones as opposed to their Sukhoi. So
well, it's going to force. Look, the Soviets, the Russians, have been very smart in protecting their most advanced fighters for two reasons, I think. Number one, because they're very advanced. Number two, it's given them a long time to get those pilots up and running, get those crews up and running, because I'm sure, they're smart, might not like their strategy and who they've been, but, we have to assume that they are intelligent in the choices that can be made. They know this day was going to come eventually. And so they're going to now have to start bringing up their most advanced generation fighters. And this is going to start putting a larger cost on the Russian Air Force. So this larger cost on the Russian Air Force is gonna, is the test, right? Because you're not regenerating an Su-57, on an assembly plant in a few days or a few months, right? These are very expensive, very costly to the Russian Air Force, and there's a larger impact here. Right, knocking each one of those out has a cost to them in terms of their defensive posture and their offensive posture towards NATO overall, not just the Ukrainian fight. So this is really a cost generation exercise by the West from a proxy standpoint. No one might say that, but I think that's obviously what it is. At the same time, it serves to support the Ukrainians and allow them an opportunity. Like I said, it's just an opportunity, right? The Ukrainians, when you keep adding all these pieces together, you are adding the management and synchronization costs that the Ukrainians have to go through. So this is a test over the next year of, are the Ukrainians able to truly integrate all these pieces together? Because that's something that the Western forces are basically designed around. When we say things like combined arms, the advanced part of it is tying all these pieces together. And that's really what we're attempting to drag the Ukrainians through, is tying all these combined arms together, which so far they've, I'd say, had a very uneven, ability to do that. I think they've been able to do that in smaller units, which is where you learn. But to move it up the echelons.
Aaron, but my question is still the Russian Air Force accounts for, I don't know, 1,500 planes?
Sure.
Something like that, right?
Yeah. So the question,
and the Ukrainian maybe like 100 or 200. So 50 F-16s would really make a difference. In this equation.
if you look at the history of F-16s in their ratio of fighting, whether it was in the Falklands, whether it was in the Gulf War, whether it was in the Gulf War One, whether it really almost anywhere there's been a fight that an F-16 been in, its performance has been pretty dramatic. You're looking at kill ratios of, between 10 to 30 to 1 or 0. So, is that a pilot issue? Sure. But it's also a platform issue.
Yeah, but still, the pilot issue. They weren't fighting Russian, who have long-term training.
So the question is this: you're bringing up a great point, which is a black hole we have right now is an understanding of what the Russians have been doing with the last 19 months in their Air Force. And we're going to find this out, right? Have the Russians taken advantage of these 19 months, spent the money, the energy, the time, training, get far enough away from the fight so that, their version of Top Gun mode, if they've done that, then I believe you're right. I believe you'll get a much, maybe more 2 to 1, you'll get a tighter ratio, and then they'll have to use the F-16s in a more strategic way, surgical way. But if the Russians haven't been spending these 19 months getting those pilots, those ground crews, those systems up to date, because when you say 1,500 airframes that the Russians have, how many of those are flight worthy? How many of those are combat flight worthy? And how many of those are sustained combat flight worthy? And when you start doing that, you start funneling down. And there's no free lunch out there, right? It's very fair for people.
If you take a half, it's still quite an advantage. If it's like a 700-800, it's still
okay. But here's the thing. Here's the thing. But the Russians aren't going to concentrate all of those in this fight. They can't afford to do that because they have to have reserves. They have to have they have to also protect the whole Russia, which is the biggest country in the world geographically. So when you start stripping that down, let's say that's 750, I don't think the Russians can put probably more than 250. And if you've got 1,000-mile front or 1,000-kilometer front, 500 to 1,000 miles. One thing about all these platforms, these things aren't like video games, right? They're not flying up there for 5 hours in a sortie, right? They're fuel, all that power, all that maneuverability. Its cost is enormous amounts of fuel. So when you mix those two things together, you start looking at environments, opportunities that the Ukrainians have, where maybe the Russians have 60 or 80 in one area, and that becomes a target area that makes more sense. This gets back to the earlier point around channeling a strategy for the Ukrainians. I would make an argument that might be literally what we're doing in the West, that we know, like, we don't want to get 500 because they're just going to spread them out anyways. So if we give them smaller bundles, it forces them to concentrate, or at least forces the strategic imperative to make that decision. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I was going to say, if you can compare this also, the Israeli Air Force in 1967 was smaller than the Egyptian Air Force or the Syrian Air Force in terms of number of planes. The thing is that the Israelis had both of those air forces when they were on the tarmac. And so Israel had air supremacy in the 6-Day War. Something very similar could happen here, because if you have multiple different bases where these Sukhoi are launching from, and we're talking about only a quarter of Russia's total because it has to defend the rest of its territory, this is not an existential war for Russia, then the numbers come a lot closer. So I think that sort of goes to Greg's point. Now we have a comment here asking to sort of, let's put this off to the side for a second. What is Russia's end goal? How does Russia win this campaign? Because at current, right, it seems like Russia's locked in this frozen war. So, or this ossifying to a frozen war scenario. So how does Russia move out of that and into a win condition?
Sure. So if you scroll back up, there's a slide on escalatory. Uh, let's go. Yep, options for deliberate escalation that would change the dynamics of the conflict. Sorry for the small font here, but I was trying to get everything in here. So this comes from a RAND corporation study that basically has that question or part of that question associated to it. So so it looks at, well, what would be the options to really fundamentally change the dynamics of the conflict? So option A, limited Russian attack against NATO and Europe. So look at the sort of the limited, weaker, smaller, Baltic states. Hit ports in Romania. Pick targets that either have the least amount of domestic forces from that state and no other Western forces. So not everything is manned and guarded 24/7 everywhere. It's the real world, not a movie. There's not Jason Bourne fighting Tom Cruise around every curve. So that would be one option, which would then attempt to force an ex-party agreement, right? So Russia trying to move away from a Ukraine negotiation and negotiate directly with the U.S. and NATO and EU states to try to put pressure on Ukraine, because that's the bet here, right? It isn't that Ukraine's a child that you can ground and prevent from going out and playing with their friends. It's an independent state, and it can keep bringing fight. And I think I brought up something maybe a year ago, which is one aspect of keeping this as a high intensity, limited war within the boundaries of Ukraine generally, or Ukraine and near Russia, is that it doesn't devolve into a Syria-like conflict, which I think most would agree would be worse than this, which is my position. Now, that is Ukraine's backup card, is, let's go Syria mode, which I think freaks everybody out, including the Russians. I think I literally probably freaks Ukrainians out. But the point is that is their, that's their ace card. And so option A has that potential to shift that for the Russians, but it also has the potential for the West to say, okay, well, let's give you a little taste of the nonlinear asymmetrical conflict. Option B is Russia provokes out of area crises.
Wait, before we leave option A for a second,
Mm-hmm.
how do we get around the sort of Kissinger-Mearsheimer perspective of NATO engages Russia because, let's say in option A, they invade Estonia. That's probably the easiest one for them to do.
Yeah, exactly. Or Latvia.
Right. So they invade this country. NATO says, okay, this is an attack against one, it's an attack against all. Article 5 is brought up because Estonia and Latvia are both NATO members. Okay, we're good to go. United States says, okay, let's come to some sort of truce. So that way we're not, launching intercontinental ballistic missiles at each other. And US directs Ukraine, okay, cede to Russia these provinces, right? That's sort of the thought process. But
that's right.
But why would the United States play that game as opposed to playing the game of, let's have a march from Eastern Europe to Moscow and just bring the air forces and just do it more traditionally and actually wreck Russia?
Yeah, so that plays into the Russian, maybe over understanding they think they have of U.S. domestic politics, I do think, I've always felt this for a long time, that outsiders sometimes, outside the United States, I think in any country, I think this is true. You sometimes, as the old saying would be, it's like you're too smart for your britches, right? About like, you think all these like really complicated dynamics are going on, and you can sort of like interstitially tie these things together, and typically that's just not very true. It's not. It might be true for one moment, but it's not consistently true. And so I do think the Russians have a belief that with our elections coming up in 24, plus some of the shifts in Europe, that there's this sort of period that they can create maximum fear, maximum sort of pressure, and that there will be a political response. And that political response will either be, we really won't defend Estonia to the fullest. We really won't, support Ukraine past, moment X, etc. So that would be the Russian view of sort of oversimplifying Western politics and not recognizing that there's been a shift underneath all of this, where we might have been in a more 50-50 negotiating position with Russia, when they invaded Georgia, but that the world's changed now, right? That the world has changed since not just this invasion, but everything else that's gone on. That Russia is now in that ex-party position where it's a lot closer to the Cold War, right? We're not looking at this as just one conflict, in a bubble. We're looking at this, collectively as
Aaron,
Yep,
but
go ahead, please.
If I may add the perspective, from my understanding, well, first of all, we see that there is in the Republican debates, there is a question about maybe stop supporting or reducing the support for Ukraine, and they call it, not even necessarily Trump, but just maybe a few others,
Sure.
because of the and in general, the Russia, what they thinking is the Russia has a military complex, and they're increasing it. I'm talking about industrially, right? They're increasing it, and they will actually keep increasing it, and they're can produce a huge amount of weapons. Maybe not, technically superior, but the quality sometimes becomes quality. And Ukraine cannot afford to really have a strong military complex on its territory, because it can be destroyed. They probably have some, hiding here and there, but they cannot really compete in that. So they're entirely dependent on the supply from Europe and the United States, and that commitment is waning. We already see some of it, and they believe in Russia that maybe hopefully next year after election things may change, but even if it's not, then over a few years it will definitely wane, and that Ukraine would not be able to sustain this industrial competition.
So I would argue that that's a big misreading, because there's been one massive change in the last month that doesn't really get a lot of notice, which is basically the South Koreans, which are really now the preeminent low cost, high quality arms manufacturer in the world. There's really actually nobody that's close second, including the United States. Just the bang for the buck that you get from the South Koreans is just incredible. That they've changed. So there's all these agreements that you have. There's special export licensing agreements. You deal with anything that's sensitive, especially military equipment, that you basically can't sell it to any other third party, blah, blah, blah. So the prior limitations South Koreans had was that you can't export whatever we sell you, regardless, unless we approve it. It's the same that the Germans had. Which comes from not wanting to contribute to conflicts and conflict escalation around the world. Well, the South Koreans have relaxed that for the United States and for the UK and for Poland, meaning that they will make 155 shells, or they will make advanced munitions that will replace the ones we have in the West, and then we can export on a per unit basis, obviously, what's the replacement. So when you start looking at the US, you look at Europe, and you look at South Korea, and I believe Japan is right on that verge also. That is a global defense industrial complex that really is the largest that we've had since at least the middle of the Cold War, and maybe even back to World War II. And that's going to be that the advantage that the Russians have, which you definitely are correct. The Russians are expanding. I think they probably doubled their industrial defense capacity already. They're probably going to try to double it again, which they probably will. But at some point you run into some limits, right? Some of it is just human. I would actually argue the bigger limits in this whole conflict are not munitions and weapon systems. It's actually people. You only have so many engineers, you only have so many industrial engineers, you only have so many experts at putting together complicated machining equipment and production lines, et cetera. And that's why you're going to have some of these upper limits hit, I think, pretty quickly in the next year to year and a half, where whatever you get is what you're going to get, right? So if the Russians only get, 50 replacement, K-bar missiles, then every month, and that's all they're going to get. And then the question becomes, well, are we really using 40 of those in Ukraine and only keeping 10 for the defense of Russia? Probably not, right? Maybe it's 25-25, right? So because obviously they've used a ton already, and they've depleted what you would argue would be their natural, defensive posture. Because, like Richard said, this is the conflict the Russians had to deal with. It's not the existential conflict, and they can't deplete all of their advanced capability in this conflict. I mean, that's what we'd like them to do, but I don't think they're that insane. They're not going to do that. They at most are going to deplete a third, is my guess, and that's an upper limit. And they've already used quite a bit, so they're going to have to replace what they've already used. Because there's some moment that this isn't about Ukraine for Russia, it's about this new posture. Because let's be honest here, the posture towards Russia from NATO has changed completely. So that means even post-Ukrainian conflict, the Russians are going to be much more in a Cold War, posture and configuration with NATO. That means they're going to have all these advanced capabilities. So that's a huge pressure. I would argue a majority of all their industrial defense expansion is going to be the build for this posture. I would say probably 3/4 of it, because they've depleted a bunch already in the last 2 years, and they're going to deplete a bunch more in the next 2 years. And I don't see anything changing this conflict in the next year to two, unless there is some.
But they're also increasing their producing capability. Right now, they're not there yet, but they're working on it. And at
absolutely.
some point, so
and that's my point. But that's still 2 years realistically. So the question is, do they want a year 4, 5, 6, 7 fight? That's a big test. Because remember, Ukrainians
they're prepared
do
for the long term. They in Russia, they're prepared for the long term for sure.
And the question
10 years.
Oh, go ahead. Please. Go ahead.
No. I meant saying long term, like 10, 15 years. They're prepared for it.
Sure. So the question becomes: are the Ukrainians prepared for a devolution from the large scale conflict to a Syrian-like civil war conflict? Because I don't believe that's the fight that Russia wants. I don't think it's the fight anybody wants, but it is ultimately Ukraine's final, existential survival option. So the second option here, if you look option B, Russia provokes an out-of-area crisis. That one, you could argue they do that pretty regularly. I don't think that has a huge implication. I think the only place that could have an implication, which the Russians for some reason haven't decided, maybe they can't because of the regimes involved, but is to project a power into the Caribbean, into Central and Northern South America, Venezuela, the whole, ex-Russia corridor, right? Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, etc., to signal to the U.S., especially specifically, that, hey, we're here. This has a cost, and or a similar type of crises, in the Mediterranean, Middle East. I mean, there's a few of these they could do that I would say have marginal impact Option C, they conduct a large-scale air and missile campaign, which they've conducted, I would say, a fairly large-scale missile and drone campaign. I think the estimates are around 10,000 missiles and drones. The air campaign's been more limited. They've used most of the air power as a way to launch a lot of those missiles. So I think they maybe have another notch there. I think the Ukrainians, as the Russians, and this is the cost that the Russians have to face, is as the Ukrainians get more air defense capability from the West, that's got great return on investment for the Ukrainians and pretty weak investment return for the Russians over time.
It should have been done a long time ago.
Absolutely. We could get into all the shoulds, and all the shoulds you could probably move.
I was going to say that sort of turns into a question that we've had, is that how does Ukraine mend the fences with some of the Western leaders, especially since, for example, there's the whole grain issue that's affecting Central Europe. So countries like Poland, Slovakia are less excited about helping Ukraine now because of the grain that's moving through their countries. So how does Ukraine make sure that they continue to receive that Western air support? Or is it really just they're going to put all their eggs in the U.S. basket?
I actually think, I think, Richard, my sort of philosophy on the over mediatization of our politics. I think we think crises that are crises aren't really crises as much as we think anymore, especially political ones, purely political ones. So Poland announced, we're not giving you more weapons unless, you don't, do dumping of grain in our market. Obviously, the Poles are going to give more weapons. They already have orders for it. The companies that are Polish and German owned are, they're not going to fire thousands, tens of thousands of workers. So at the end of the day, these are, I argue, mostly signaling exercises by all the parties to try to come up with these market fixes. I mean, look, at the end of the day, if the US wanted to solve the grain crisis, it's pretty simple. Write a check for $4 billion a month out of USAID and State Department, everybody, and sell the grain that the Ukrainians have to across Africa and to any other place with need, and use that as soft power against the Chinese and the Russians at this point. And then if you want to bring the Europeans, the Japanese, the South Koreans, because they'd all love to be on that, campaign boat together, you can do that. So far, the parties don't want to do that for whatever political leadership vacuum that exists.
But Aaron, isn't the Russian blockade of the ports, doesn't that factor into that solution?
It factors partially into that because, but part of that solution could be, hey, Turkey, do you want to increase your soft power? So let's flag some Turkish vessels that do this. And one thing Russia's been pretty good about the last 200 years, not provoking a Black Sea conflict with Turkey, because you're not moving Turkey. Like you can't actually shove the place out of the way. The Bosphorus is where it is. So, there are, for let's call them policy entrepreneurs, solutions out there. Are they all great? Do they all work perfect? Of course not. But you start working the edges to them, and you can move a huge amount of grain down through the freight rail system to Romania, and then you can flag Turkish and Romanian vessels. And the way you go. And is Russia really looking to sink a Turkish and Romanian flagged vessel with grain going to Africa? I mean, they might do one. Are they going to sink 5? I doubt it. And so those are the types of things that could be done. But right now, what we're saying to the Ukrainians is good luck selling grain to, because what's going on here, I think people don't understand the budget dynamics going on in Ukraine. What we're doing in the West, because, of some political accounting games, is we're basically saying, here's a bunch of aid for your economy, the civilian side of your economy. You sell grain to fund your military domestically, and then we grant weapons. And the 2, 3, 4, 5 shall meet. That's this sort of kabuki theater that we're playing. And the Russians are trying to figure out, where they can, apply pressure in that. And then at a certain point, because the Ukrainians have to sell this grain because they need that foreign currency, because they got to fund their military, because we're basically funding, like the grants we're doing, the aid we're doing, we're funding the domestic side of the Ukrainian economy. Their budget deficit on the domestic side of spending, we're funding a huge amount of that. And then they're using domestic taxes and anything they can sell to basically fund their military. And any overage that goes into the rest of their domestic spending. And then we're giving them in the West, 50+ billion in munitions and weapon systems. That's the kabuki theater going on. And so at this point, we don't seem to have the leadership. It doesn't exist, or the leaders are unwilling to step into that breach to say, hey, let's cut a different grain deal, some type of market mixed solution. And then let's benefit your customers, which, an enormous amount of the Ukrainian customers are in Africa, Middle East, and some in Europe, obviously. And the Poles, and let's be real here, right? The Ukrainians are a agricultural superpower relative to the rest of Western Europe, right? And that's always been one of the issues of Ukraine coming into the EU that nobody really talks about, is how would you handle farmer protection, agribusiness, etc. Because they could flood, they could just completely dominate those markets, and you would have just 20 countries having crises. It wouldn't even get to that point. I mean, it just wouldn't. So and you're seeing the test case of this, with the polls right now. So anyways, go ahead.
So sorry, we have another question.
Yeah.
So, and I'll actually read out the question because there's a lot of interesting statistics in it. So most of the war has been fought on Ukrainian soil, which has destroyed the Ukrainian infrastructure and economic production. And this would read as a war of attrition. So this could also be a Russian win condition, that Ukraine is basically taken off the map for the next 20 years, let's say, in terms of actual productivity. So can Ukraine actually win just from the perspective of they're not taken off the map for 20 years? For example, in 2022, Ukrainian debt was, Ukrainian debt was 130 billion compared to 161 billion in GDP. In 2023. Comparatively, in 2022, Russia had a GDP of 2.25 trillion compared to 365 billion in debt. Based on the numbers,
Sure.
Russia has the ability to buy arms, invest in ramping arms production while avoiding significant impacts on their economy. Despite sanctions from most Western countries, NATO, and the US, Russia's economy has more or less stayed afloat and even increased in GDP. It appears the Russian economy has been persevering, while the Ukrainian economy continues to suffer, and its citizens are displaced at an exponential rate. Overwhelmingly, it seems that Russia can continue this war of attrition more successfully than Ukraine can.
I mean, maybe. I mean, it's an optional war for Russia, because at the end of the day, unless Russia wants to reinvade the rest of Ukraine, which they failed in their key airport invasion attempt 19 months ago, this is really just a fight for what was the originally annexed 2014 part of Ukraine. I mean, you could argue, you could take the opposite position, which is the cost generated by Russia, which is probably in the trillions when it's all said and done, for maybe 10% more, if that, than they had in 2014, is a historical mismatch of pretty biblical proportions and return on investment. So that's one point. The second point is, where I think the question is correct, is this whole these eastern oblasts are just are destroyed. I mean, it's just that simple, and the cost to that is likely hundreds of billions. Now, I believe the Russians are basically saying, well, you took, I mean, we're never going to get that third of $1 trillion back out of that are lockboxed in all the central banks and treasuries. So we're going to take that out of Ukraine. I'm not saying that they sit there and have a whiteboard that says that, but I think intuitively that's happening, or that's happened. I think all the parties know that. So I don't think what was productive in that part of Ukraine is going to be productive for, you know, generations probably. And the Russians are, if they have to leave or if they choose to move away from this conflict, they're going to leave, you know, whatever the number will be, tens of millions of landmines. This will be the major this will be the landmine capital of the world that will be spending, you know, 50 years like we did after World War I, digging out landmines and trying to prevent, you know, people, kids, etc., from being, you know, wounded and maimed and killed. So they achieved that aim of making those oblasts in the east unproductive. The larger question is the Ukrainians, and this is one thing I think doesn't get a lot of publicity. Ukrainians are making Crimea unproductive for the Russians. It's not there yet, but if the targeting goes on further and the next generation of attack come in, that's a cost for Russia. And if there is something strategic, which Greg's pointed out over the last few years, it is Crimea for the Russians. I mean, these oblasts in the east are not actually strategic for the Russians. I mean, they're trying to make them strategic for the Russians the same way as the U.S. was attempting to make parts of Iraq strategic, which didn't work. But when it comes to Crimea, you could argue that is strategic. And so if in the end, the Russians have a similarly destroyed Crimea, when it comes to its ability to have a Black Sea fleet occupy and dominate Black Sea and turn it into a Russian lake, well, that's a huge cost for Russia. And when you start weighing what they had in 2014, Crimea, Black Sea fleet, half of the Black Sea is a Russian lake, let's say, and a slow burn conflict, to what they have now and what they could have in 2-3 years, it's hard to see this as a sort of a Russian success. And I think one thing that isn't classified much is this Crimea cost to Russia, because it is devastating, right? You're not regenerating ships in any time. You're just not putting cruiser, destroyer, frigate, corvette hulls together like, artillery pieces, right? These are decade-long, multi, 100 billion ruble type, maybe even trillion rubles when you put it all together, type, endeavor. Especially losing a kilo submarine, if they start going after, there's only so many of those subs, right? If they get another 1 or 2 subs, that's transformative for Russian subsurface operations. And that's transformative in Russian subsurface operations against the United States, specifically, not against Ukraine. So there's cost here that Russia is at risk, especially naval costs. I think that's the least appreciated aspect of this whole war, because Russia has put their naval parts, I'd say whatever, third of their naval capability at risk in this war. And so anyways, I wanted to go through quickly some of these options here, because some of them are pretty interesting. So option D, Russia initiates large-scale use of chemical weapons. I think that's a Rubicon, large scale, small scale. You could argue they've already done that in Syria. So they've already crossed that. Syria's already done it, right? Everyone's sort of already done it. Not everyone, but a lot of the team bad guys. The Chinese, and I think the test for this is Chinese, right? The Chinese have not really had a problem with very tactical employment by parties. Large scale, I think, escalates that dramatically, that's a test of their relationship with China. I think they would only get a go from China if they could do that. That would be a fairly radical escalation that would put all of the parties, well, two things happen if that happens. That puts all the parties in the West supporting Ukrainian crisis. It changes the coalition dynamics. I think there becomes one group that is a hard peace group in the West, but then another group that's a hard war, because they're saying, well, if the Russians go to this, they're going to go to anything. And then I think in Ukraine, it forces the Syria option much faster. You go to chemical, you will see hundreds to probably thousands of attacks across Russia, conventional attacks, small scale saboteur type attacks, assassination. I mean, just it'll explode. And so I think that's a governor here for the Russian. Initiating underground nuclear tests. I am a little surprised the Russians haven't been, I don't mean just loose nuke talk, but which the Russians sort of, I think they've over-exercised that one, right? They did that for like 18 months and people were like, okay, that's the town drunk, just screaming nuclear bombs every day. Like, it's just not worth anything. I do think going to nuclear testing or regenerating nuclear testing programs would definitely signal a tremendous shift in Russian posture. I do believe the governor on that is the Chinese, though. Chinese never want any shift in nuclear posture because they're such a disadvantage to the United States, right? They're at a 10-to-1 just in total of warheads, but it's more like 50-to-1 count the capabilities. And the Chinese don't want because once there's real nuclear activity, then I think the final draw in the Indo-Pacific is the world's largest ballistic missile shield that would be put together by all the non-Chinese allied states to protect themselves. And the Chinese know that that's something they realistically can't do. And they're trying to prevent that from happening, or at least delay that from happening until they have such a posture nuclear capability in 10, 15, 20 years that they can match US capabilities or come close to it. So I think that hamstrung the Russians quite a bit because they're really dependent on that Chinese relationship. Russia use of nuclear weapons inside Ukraine, obviously it's the same thing. I think it's chemicals, large chemicals, and more nuclear testing. And then Ukraine expands its strikes inside Russia. As you can see, these are the sort of dynamics which really haven't changed in the last 18 months. I mean, it's the same basic dynamics. And I don't think these are going to change in the next 18 months or the next 3-4 years, right? There's not going to be an alien invasion that's going to change all of that here. So I do think this is a great way to frame by Rand of all the limits and options that the parties have. And of course, Ukraine's options are basically guerrilla Syrian type of conflict and acid strikes, escalatory strikes in Russia by small unit suicide type operations, assassination operations, etc., which they've done. The one thing that's happened, boiling the frog, right? The concept of boiling the frog is that 18 months ago, we never would have believed one iota of any operation that the Ukrainians could have on Russian territory would be an immediate escalation to nuclear weapons. Well, there's been a slow boil, if you notice, where at this point, the Ukrainians have conducted hundreds of strikes at least in Russia, and eventually probably thousands. And that's become acceptable within the confines of this conflict. And so I think that's a shift in natural escalation that the West has gotten comfortable to, the Russians are comfortable with. I'm not saying they like it, but they have not gone out of party. They still value those NATO red lines. And there's something about this re-strengthening of the NATO alliance, the Article 5, that the Russians just don't seem to want to cross that at this point, and or really test it. There was a little bit of testing You could argue when Wagner was on holiday in Belarus until an air mishap happened last month. And Wagner jokes, they have to keep coming. And if you notice, there was a huge shift in posture by the Baltics, by the Poles, everybody. They were preparing for any Wagner activities along the border. So I do think the Russians recognize now that conducting any large scale operations into NATO is going to be just really problematic. I just don't think it's effective. I think objectively, if there's an operation conducted by Russia, there will be a parity attack, meaning, let's say a short range missile is launched, 30 kilometers away from the Russian border on the Russian side, and it hits, target X in one of the Eastern European countries. You'll see a direct response targeted just to that missile battery, right? Nothing else. It'll be one for one. So it'll be very limited, be no escalation on the Western side, at least in the beginning. And I think the Russians know that. And I'm sure we've signaled to them, if you value what's shooting at us, then don't shoot at us. And I think that's where we are. So I think the Russians in some ways are hamstrung in this limited war. You could argue that's the biggest Nobel Prize, if there can be one for this whole thing, that the Western leaders have done. They've constructed this in a way that it's contained to a limited war inside of Ukraine and into valuable assets that are strikeable by Ukraine and Russia. And that's really it in this conflict. I mean, even Belarus, outside of a few attacks by the Ukrainians, maybe a dozen to 2 dozen, they haven't brought Belarus into the fight. And the Russians haven't brought Moldova in either. So it's been very contained. So I do think, so I know that sort of, hopefully that addressed all those escalation questions and how the conflict could change. Anything else?
Yes,
Yeah,
it
sure.
did. There are a couple other slides that you have that I think are really interesting. I mean, they're all great, but
Thank you, Richard.
I think this one is going to be very important for a lot of people.
Sure.
So we were talking at the very big top of last hour, right? The possibility of breach and how breach happens. If you could sort of walk through what we're looking at in these different pictures, and so people can understand from a military perspective why it is that this great summer offensive turned into a summer sit down.
Yeah, or I would say it turned into you could argue it turned into the beginnings of these breaching tenets, right? So when you do breaching, so let's back up, right? The US and the NATO allies are the ones that are supporting the Ukrainian defense and their breaching operations, which means the equipment, the training, the development, everything is based on NATO and US doctrine. And specifically, the majority of it's based on US Army doctrine. That's a different question around Marine amphibious assault and breaching, which nobody seems to want to go there yet with developing Ukrainian Marine force to scale, but that's a different question. But so we're looking at the land conflict based on the maps we looked at earlier. So I wanted to lay that out there, right? So this isn't coming sort of as a theoretical discussion, right? It's you're going to use the equipment we're giving you from the West, and you use our trainers, and you're going to develop your technique. Well, those are going to be based on the doctrine we already have that we've developed for, better part of the last 100 years. So the US Army breaching tenets are pretty straightforward. It's intelligence, breaching fundamentals, breaching organization, mass, and synchronization. So when you go through each of these, there's a whole intelligence piece, which I believe has been pretty strong between drones, satellite, human intelligence, communications, intelligence, etc. And so you're basically building, think of it as like a bunch of 3D maps of not just what's in front of you, but what's behind what's in front of you, right? So it goes through depth, because you have to know, not just, you just don't get through the first element that you're breaching, you have to get to some objective, right? So that's something that's important that I think is always missed, because you watch movies and it's sort of like the breach is just the first element stage, and then like you win. Like in the real world, like, no, we're trying to get to that town, which is being protected by these 5 defensive lines. That town is strategic because it's a nexus of 3 roads. And that's what we really want, are those 3 roads, because from there we can conduct, operations in all these different directions. So your breaching is not the objective. Your breaching is a path to get to your objective. So when you have breaching fundamentals, which is the list below you, you suppress, you obscure, you secure, you reduce, and you install. Like that's how the process works. And so when you suppress, well, you're using, and these are limitations, right? So the Ukrainians don't have naval fire weapons, but they don't have a navy. They have very limited air weapons. You can count the drones, so kind of, but they don't really have air platforms that they're able to deliver guided and unguided dumb and smart bombs to defensive elements that the Russians have.
Wait, Aaron, do you mind if we take sort of a break on this, and because we have a few questions that I think might be interesting.
Okay, cool.
Mark, you want to ask something?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. Aaron, thanks for the presentation, first of all.
Thank you.
It's my question is really more kind of a comment and of ask you if my thinking is correct.
Yeah.
My question that I pose myself is, when I see this warfare, stagnant warfare, I think, okay, when's this happened before? Western Front, World War I. Okay, and then I like to think of history in analogies and compare situations, compare and contrast. So when I think of World War I, in terms of military technologies, what you had is the invention of heavy machine guns that forced troops into trenches, and massed artillery that killed everyone. And then later on, you had the technologies of tank warfare and aviation and combined arms of that overcame that blockage, that stagnation. And then you compare that to the Ukrainian war, and you have all these technologies that have been out there for decades and decades, but they've been mutually nullified. So neither side has supremacy or superiority in the air. So it's kind of like it doesn't exist. And neither side has sufficient armored forces for maneuver warfare. And that's why we have the stagnation in Ukraine now. So is that a valid analogy, a valid?
100%.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's exactly right. And nothing's really going to change that much when it comes to that. That's why this shift in strategy is so fundamental. Because if you don't change the definition of insanity from, the old age. So.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. The other question that was sort of in the comments, and I think I might be a little bit better poised to address it, is concerning what's going on in Nagorno-Karabakh and how it affects or is related to what's going on in Ukraine. So for those who don't remember, there's a breakaway region in the western part of Azerbaijan called Nagorno-Karabakh, Mountainous Karabakh, or by its own inhabitants, Artsakh, and it's populated by mostly Armenians as a result of a long-standing historical presence of the Armenians in the mountains. The Turkish Azerbaijanis existed primarily in the lowlands. You get to the late 80s and early 90s, and the Armenians in the highlands were able to push the Azerbaijanis not only out of the area of mountainous Karabakh, but also some of the lowlands as well. In 2020, Azerbaijan had built back its military and was able to, in basically a month-long lightning war with drones, take back not only all of the lowland regions that have been ceded, but also some of the highlands. So now Azerbaijan controls the city of Shusha, which is the second largest city in the mountainous region. And Azerbaijan's understanding of the ceasefire that was signed in November of 2020 had the perspective that there should be no armed groups operating within the Armenian controlled, and by Armenian, I mean Armenian people, because the government is slightly different, Armenian controlled Nagorno-Karabakh. The Armenians who are self-governing in that area disagree with this assertion because they believe that if they put down their arms, Azerbaijan will just come and invade. About 24 hours ago, Azerbaijan launched an invasion into those parts of Armenia that are still controlled, those parts of Karabakh that are still controlled by Armenians. And what ended up occurring is that those incursions resulted in they were supposedly targeted attacks on the city of Stepanakert, which is the capital of the Armenian-controlled region, which the Azerbaijanis called Khankendi. And yeah, so this has basically proved that Azerbaijan can puncture into Nagorno-Karabakh whenever it wants. And in the last 2 years, since November, last 3 years, since November of 2020, there's been a slow-moving blockade on the region to prevent it from getting supplies. So it's really a question of whether Armenia can hold, Armenian people can hold this territory against the Azerbaijani government. And the way it plays into the Ukraine war is that Russian peacekeepers were part of the solution in November of 2020. They were the ones who were responsible for maintaining the ceasefire between the two sides. And Russian peacekeepers are relatively thin on the ground at current because they've been trained to fight the war in Ukraine. So Azerbaijan is really seeing this as a moment where it has a better hand to play than it has ever had with regard to resolving the Karabakh conflict in its direction.
Richard, can I add a little bit to it? Because
Sure.
I'm in Yerevan right now. And I was watching those protests, and I was talking to people trying to understand what's happening. So the current government of Pashinyan, who is the leader, and this, it basically is supported by the people, and that the protest staged by the previous government, pro-Russian, and people know that it's very corrupt because Pashinyan has been working against the corruption. So they've been staged, and even the gas was used. The police was involved. I mean, I was not there when the gas was used, but I was there when there were protests. It's actually center because I was going to History of Armenia Museum. That's the best museum in Yerevan. But the thing is that I believe that right now, United States has a great opportunity to stand up for Armenia, because Russia is not going to stand up for Armenia right now. They want this government out because they're anti-Russian. I think because nobody else is the kind of supporting Armenia. Nobody at all. The only thing maybe Iran supporting Armenia.
Right.
But if United States, because Iran is threatened by this coalition between Azerbaijan and Turkey, but
And Israel.
but if United States would stand on the Armenian side, that would actually give I'm sure, like I've been asking people, like what would they all say? Well, whoever can really guarantee some peace for us, guarantee some, because they're very traumatized by the loss of Karabakh. And they say if United States can guarantee that the people would immediately turn for the U.S. in Armenia, and that would be like a really sore in a Russian eye, and really established. So I think so. I don't know what other people think, but that's my get. I mean, not that I'm for it or against it, but it's been interesting to see it.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, if you're actually in Yerevan, how do people react? Because I mean, we see it in the news all the time, but how are people reacting to the possibility of either the European Union or the United States genuinely taking a stronger role? Or do they just think that it's so unlikely that it's not even worth consideration? Because I mean, both those things can be true.
If they would take a role, I mean, Armenian people will definitely turn towards West. That's my understanding here. It will immediately will happen because they're very frustrated. They still pro-Russian generally, but they're very frustrated. And from what I hear from Russian media, they're so anti-Pashinyan government. Pashinyan is the
president of Armenia.
Yeah. So he is the one. They're really against him. They're very sarcastic remarks, and they just want to see. Well, you see, you have him. So now you see what's going to happen. If you would have had the previous government, then maybe. But Russia not in the position to really take a stronger role for Armenia, because they're very much dependent on Turkey, because Turkey basically is helping Russia to evade sanctions. It's a major player. Most of the sanctions right now evaded because of Turkey and China, but
Georgia.
Well, not so much Georgia, but Georgia is mostly Turkey. Most of the imports now goes through Turkey. Most of the import of Western goods goes through Turkey right now.
Okay.
That's ridiculous, right? What are the sanctions for if they allow Turkey to use it to its advantage to gain economic strength from helping Russia evade sanctions?
Yeah. No, I mean, this is one of the things I sort of covered in my Middle Eastern history series. But in 1950, when Turkey really applied to become part of NATO and it was accepted in 1952, Turkey was probably the most gung-ho pro-West country in NATO, certainly much more than France, for example, which had its own I want to rule the world aura to it. But in fact, they proposed invading Syria and Iraq in 1955 and in 1958, respectively, on behalf of NATO. But of course, Turkey's gone through a lot of political changes since the 1950s. And so the Turkey of that time is not the Turkey of this time. And the question of whether or not its values align with NATO and, has fundamentally changed.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I'm just curious why West doesn't take advantage of this situation.
Yeah. I would say one thing. I think at a diplomatic strategic level, there's a lot of game theory going on. And I do believe that Russia has held back escalating in, we'll call it the legacy Monroe Doctrine sphere of the U.S., which is basically the Caribbean and Central South America. And I think they've done this not because they're such wonderful people, because it's the international game theory. No one's wonderful. I mean, maybe whatever, Swedes or something, but right, Iceland, maybe they're wonderful, except they kill whales, right? But I think they're keeping it as a card, right? Because it gives them a tool in the toolbox if there's something that happens that they don't like in the next 1 to 2 years, because you can only use that so many times, right? So I think if the U.S. supported or attempted to support Armenia, that the Russians would view that as a more direct intervention in their sphere of influence, and that they would generate an escalation in quote unquote our sphere of influence, even though that's not really our sphere of influence
Yeah.
anymore.
But it would be much more difficult for them to do that because, you know, in Cuba, Russia is no longer that popular at all. And and you know, Venezuela is now so much dependent on oil export that's renewed. So they don't have much capability to utilize that. You know, Western. So I don't know. Yeah, I'm not.
But to me, that's probably the only thing that makes sense to me, and why we won't engage that.
There are actually two other reasons that make sense to me. The first one is brought up by Patty in the comments, which is that there's no clear benefit to the United States for having Armenia on its side.
That's true.
Like Armenia, they have a nuclear power plant. That's probably like the only.
It's a spoiler. It's all it is a spoiler operation for us.
Right.
We don't usually like doing spoiler operations because we're not very good at them.
Right. So that's number one. And number two is that Armenia has no direct access to any U.S. positions. The closest would be Incirlik in Turkey, but the Turkish-Armenian position, the Turkish-Armenian border is blockaded since 1992. Yeah,
of course.
So the way in would be through Georgia, and Georgia's government is less pro-Western than it has historically been. And sort of covered that about 3 weeks ago in my 4 weeks ago.
It also spirals. It spirals this into a regional conflict that we don't tend to be really good at managing this, and then things go off the rails, I think, a lot quicker.
Yeah, I think the situation, if Armenia was an island in the Black Sea as opposed to a landlocked country surrounded by two countries with which the United States has decent relations and two countries with which the United States has horrible relations, it's not, it's not that great.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, okay.
Mark, you wanted to add something?
Turkey needs to be, I mean, not Turkey really, Erdogan. they something needs to be, somebody has to stand up to him. What he's doing is so anti-Western. It's amazing. It's a blunt, way of counteracting Western sanctions, and I don't know why it's being tolerated.
Because the opposition to him is not much better on most of the major questions. I don't see Kılıçdaroğlu, for example, who was running against him in the most recent election in 2022. I don't see him as being, more pro-Western on the Ukraine question. I see him as incredibly destabilizing on the Syria question, because he was going to force all the 3.2 million Syrians in Turkey to go back to Syria. And Kılıçdaroğlu, it also doesn't have better positions on the Kurdish question. So yes, is he more secular? Sure. But I don't see anybody in the Turkish political world who is either not a nationalist like MHP or Islamist like Erdogan, or nationalist but sort of social democrat, but without a real rudder in terms of implementing liberal policies at home, like Kılıçdaroğlu. So I don't really see somebody who the West can say, this is what a democratic, like small, like SPD in Germany, or Socialist in France. Like, I don't see any of that in Turkey. Mark?
Yeah, they're all in jail. They're all in jail, the ones that could have been. But possibly. Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, no. I totally get it. That it's hard, but I think But I think enforcing the sanctions and controlling the Western goods where they're going to, I think it's possible to tighten that because that's really shameful.
Mark?
Yeah, thanks. I was just going to add to what Richard and Aaron were saying about the Armenia and a Western alliance not really going to happen. The other side of it is that the Armenian-Russian alliance is a natural alliance for both countries, and geography matters a lot. In the words of one British prime minister in the 1920s, said that the Polish corridor was not worth the bones of one British grenadier. Americans are not going to line up to make sure of a particular frontier for Armenia. But Russians, I mean, now Russia is weak now, so that alliance is weak. Eventually, Russia will get stronger, and that Russian-Armenian alliance will come back to its closer to an historic norm. It's not something that the West is going to break.
Yeah,
So,
I would agree. I would agree. I think there's like an equilibrium there that is so entrenched,
yeah,
both
that's
culturally,
a good word for it.
politically, the culturally, politically, religiously, economically even. I mean, so it's
And it's 200 years old. There's a reason why the Armenians reached and there's that alliance, because they're surrounded by Muslims for the most part, and that's the way Armenia stays an entity.
Yeah, I think the only thing that would ever change this would be a complete transformation, modernization in Iran, because of the geography of obviously next to each other. That if you had a modernized, Turkey-like Iran, so I'm not arguing, a Sweden-like Iran, but like a Turkey-like Iran, then I think Armenia would be in play again in a different way.
Yeah, like
Because
a collapse of the Russian Empire, or a revival of the the Iranian Empire against the Azerbaijanis, because the Iranians they have a huge minority in the northwest of Iran. Our Iranians don't like a strong Azerbaijan. Those two kind of things might upset that equilibrium that we were talking about, but nothing else.
And I'm not taking over/under bets on those right now. So
No.
Anyway, so let's finish up breaching. We've got about 10 minutes before I've got to go.
Let's breach the next 10 minutes. That was a bad joke. That was a bad dad joke there. All right, so I quickly went over just sort of the basic tenets and the process of or the principles behind it, which is your fundamentals are suppressing, obscuring, securing, reducing, and assaulting. So the suppression part is typically this combination of fires, artillery, heavy mortars, etc., anti-mining fires, precision-guided fires from air platforms, rotary wing, and naval fires. Well, the Ukrainians don't have like a lot of that, like probably 2/3 of that. So they're limited, which that means your suppression process is limited, right? Let's put it, the degree of suppression that you can count on until you begin your assault. And then the obscuring parts, which are, smoke and feint, right? Which are a big deal actually in breaching operations, right? You're trying to spread out your targeted enemy breach points to obscure where you're actually going to be breaching through. And then you go through the securing and reducing of the elements that you're going to be breaching against, and then you obviously begin your assault. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff you need for these assaults. I have sort of a very easy summarization at the bottom. It's a lot more than this, but you have a whole bunch of special vehicles, which these aren't made on one of the UAW. Actually, they are made on a UAW line, but they're not made on one of these UAW lines that are making all the US trucks that are on strike right now. But you don't get the volumes that you have in traditional vehicles. These are highly specialized vehicles that take typically months to manufacture individually. You have these line chargers, which you have to sort of dig out of your inventory and recertify, get the scale behind this, right? Because while we have all these capabilities, especially in the U.S. Army and a smaller degree in the Marine Corps and in parts of NATO, they're in small numbers, right? We don't have the kind of scale that the Ukrainians require, which are going to be, I'd say, hundreds of these special vehicles, if not probably thousands when you count the Ukrainian version of hacking them. They'll take other vehicles, sort of hack them. they can put these like cranes on the front that have a bunch of rotating chains that are sitting out, 50 feet in front of the vehicle. Like they'll hack these because they're Ukrainian. They can hack, seems like anything. And these line chargers that do the same, but you need thousands of these because you're also going to lose a lot of these. I mean, these are sitting ducks when you're doing this, right? So the Russians are going to use anti tank missiles basically and hammer these plus their artillery. And then you use a bunch of cluster munitions. So one of the things that wasn't discussed is a big part of why we transferred a ton of cluster munitions was that cluster munitions are an effective way to deal with the top layer of mines. So the Russians are, a superpower of mines. So the way they'll lay the most contested areas, you could have up to 5 to 6 mines in those, right? So those are hard. Right? That's like old school World War II demining, right? You're going to need engineers crawling, putting a charge vest inside there, and then putting another one after each one blows to make sure the mines are gone. I mean, and that's going to take you, that's weeks for every few, 100 feet, 100 yards. If you, and so one other thing to this, if you go to the next slide, Richard, oh, you get to the next slide. Are you there? All right, there we go. Back. Oh, no. Just go forward. Go forward. Yeah. Yep. Next slide. There you go. Thanks. So
Sorry
this
about
gives you kind of, yeah, that's fine. That's no problem. This gives you kind of like the, cocktail party summary of it all. So breaching is conducted by rapidly applying concentrated efforts at a point to reduce the obstacle and penetrate the defense. Your mass combat power is directed against that weakness, right? So a big part of it is, it's rapid, concentrated, your mass, right? So that's hard to do when you have a structure like the Ukrainian forces that's spread out. And so one of the things you have to do to change that is you create what's called a task organization. So in the military, a task organization is this reallocation of forces to support a particular task. That's why it's called that. So you take pieces from different units that are logical and contiguous to each other and purposeful, and then you put them together and then you train. Well, that's hard to do in the middle of this kind of fight, but it's critical to do because the way you would use engineers in a regular force are very different than when you have these breaching operations, or the same with your firing force or your maintenance people, or everything really. And the reason you're doing all this is the second piece here. Breaching operations require precise synchronization of the breaching fundamentals, fort, breach, assault. Failure to synchronize, effective suppression and obscuring with the obstacle reduction and assault can result in rapid, devastating losses of the friendly forces. I think we've seen that out of the Ukrainians for the last 3 months or so. Yeah, I'd say 3-4 months. And that's this cycle. And this is arguably one of the hardest things to do. And actually the hardest thing to do is to do this while you're amphibiously assaulting. So that's actually what the US Marines can do. And that was a different point I had earlier about developing Ukrainian Marines as a long-term objective, which it doesn't seem like all the parties want to do that, which I don't really understand that after a year and a half. It doesn't make sense to me. Because I think that scares the Russians in Crimea quite a bit. So when you put all this together, you have the support, you breach, and you assault, and you have to have all these pre-battle planning and communication. So this is the hard part of the fight that the Ukrainians are in. And it goes back to the original conversation we had almost 2 hours ago, which we'll finish up in the next minute or two, which is how wide and broad this front is, and the ability, hopefully, that many of you can see after today's conversation, of pulling all these specialized capabilities together to synchronize, requires you to sort of basically pick some spot. And when you guys go through the maps and get a chance to look at those online, and Richard, if you could put both those links in, if they're not already in, so everyone can see those, then you can actually see, well, where does this make sense? You know, where's the concentration that the Russians have? Where is the concentration that the Ukrainians have? And they can't, because at this point, the Ukrainians have about 6 fronts, which I think is just not pragmatic at this point. I think they're going to need to pick what everyone said made sense 18 months ago, which is in the South. And that's where they need to concentrate, because I still believe this war goes through Crimea. I've always believed this from the beginning, because that's the existential thing for Russia. And if there is a negotiating table here, which I don't think there is, but if there is, I think it's through Crimea. So, any other questions? Hopefully this was a good, breakdown in the last couple months since our last time that we did this. And we were waiting for some evolution on the battlefield, which I think we did get some. Mark, do you have your question? No, Mark, your hand's still up.
It takes a few seconds to unmute myself for,
Oh, okay. No
for the
problem.
permission and for me to move the mouse. So it takes a few seconds.
Gotcha. No problem.
Okay, so something that happened recently, the Ukrainians punching holes in a Russian submarine, the Minsk,
Yep.
and attacking the naval headquarters in Sevastopol.
Yep.
I'm wondering why why are they concentrating or using precious cruise missiles, but the British ones apparently, against naval targets, as opposed to, I would think, more important, juicier targets on land around, especially around Zaporizhia, so that they can breach those trenches.
I disagree on one piece of this. I think there's nothing like naval costs for anyone on Earth. It's
True.
just the cost of a
They can't
ship,
replace them. Yeah, they can't replace them.
marine,
Yeah.
and also just the raw cost of it, right? I mean, just how much these things cost, these systems, right? They're not a thing individually. They're collective systems of hundreds of thousands of pieces of material, and typically thousands of people. And so I think when given an opportunity, I mean, number one, you have a chance to hit Russian naval command. The Russians, I can't understand why they would have a 4-star and their staff sitting in a building above ground in this kind of conflict. But I don't think they'll be doing that again. But the ability to take out or severely disable, a huge part of the Black Sea Command Fleet commanders and their command staff, and hit 2, 3, 4 ships, including a submarine, I think is a pretty good return on maybe a few $1 million in precision guided munitions, 5 million or whatever it is. And I think they're not going to get too many of those opportunities. Maybe they'll get 1 or 2 more like this that are that, available, that easy. They probably won't get even that, but so I think that's why they did it. They took advantage of it. And then also it's signaling that the cost of Crimea is higher than anything that the Russians pay, right? When the Russians send, sad legions of hundreds of thousands of poor Russian men from all of their forest oblasts, I don't think they care that much about that. But when they lose kilo submarines and frigates and cruisers, that's a significant cost, and I'd say senior command, right? A cost of a senior command staff for the Russian Navy is tremendous, right? That's probably worth hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah, I certainly don't disagree with that aspect, and certainly the Russians can't repair nor build new ships very easily. But I'm just thinking, and I get it, but nullifying the Russian Black Sea Fleet won't help them reach the Sea of Azov, and that's
I
critical.
mean, I think what it does is it forces the Russians to have to spare, because also don't forget that I think the most important thing they did there in the last few weeks is they took out the latest S-400 X series battery, which is the most cutting edge S-400 that the Russians. It's probably the best air defense system on Earth, actually, and which is a big deal, right? That everyone was paying attention to that, because how they did that becomes a template for everybody to understand. That's how you deal with an S-400X class anti-aircraft or air defense system. And so that cost the Russians probably $1 billion also. So these $1 billion hits that are all built in Crimea, there's no way they can generate these multi-billion dollar hits anywhere else except for going into Russia itself. And by the way, Crimea in a weird way acts as a proxy for Russian territory, given how much Russia bangs the drum and says this is Russian territory. And so proving that we can, and you got to realize how this is like a kabuki theater, right? So if I can hit you on what you call Russian territory in Crimea, well, then I can hit you in Rostov-on-the-Don because it's Russian territory, right? Like it's this little shell game, because the Russians are sort of saying, well, that's Russian territory. Well, okay, so what's the difference?
Yeah, without the West saying you're escalating things.
That's exactly right. And I think that's part of the strategic calculus of the Ukrainians. And I think the West is calibrating in a very deliberate, piecemeal way, that you're boiling the frog, basically, because the next stage is Rostov-on-the-Don, which isn't a huge leap, to be honest, especially with ATACMS coming in. And I think the one thing we didn't talk about today, and I know you ran out of time, Richard, is the fact that you do have ATACMS and precision guided munitions coming in to Russia. I mean, to Ukraine over the next, already, but and I think those are going to be used exactly like you said, Mark. They're going to be used for very, very strategic targets, because the U.S. is, in a strange way, the U.S. by giving the Ukrainians ATACMS now are in the same munitions production dilemma that the Russians are in with their calibers and their highest. So both sides are going to be piecemealing these 10, maybe 20 a month of these high-end precision munitions, the highest end, basically ballistic missiles, short medium range ballistic missiles, because each side can only produce, maybe 50, and you're going to want to keep 30 and then sell 20 to them, to the Ukrainians or Russians, to bring to the front against Ukraine. So that's going to be where both sides get, I think, very surgical with their ballistic missiles. The Russians have not been that surgical with their ballistic missiles, which I've been sort of surprised. Either the missiles aren't that capable, which doesn't make a lot of sense, given how others have used them, or they're not that capable of using them, which maybe I'll give that a 30% chance, or they have really poor intelligence, which is maybe what's going on right now. I think the Ukrainians are obscuring targets a lot greater than we understand at this point. So that could be a real challenge. There's also the last piece to this that is a transformation in war at this point, is the way that everyone, it's like a German layer cake, maybe wrong analogy, sorry. It's a layer cake, a wedding layer cake of from the cheapest drones to the low cost rocket assisted artillery, to medium drones, special built ones that are basically cheap ballistic missiles, to low end rocket missiles, to medium, to these high end ones. And it's sort of like a pyramid stack. And you sort of wear down a strategic target, like an S-400 battery or whatever, by going up that chain and seeing what the different responses are. It's like jazz almost, like they're figuring out what the rhythm is that they want to play to based on that back and forth of that defensive response. And that is this new evolution. And the Russians are applying it also. So they're both doing it. And that is a transformation that is going to be felt forever now. The Chinese, obviously, in some ways, the Chinese were theoretically building this, but now with the use by Ukraine and Russia, that gives them a real template. And then the US and the allies in the Pacific and others in the world are going to have to figure out how to counter this, because it's what makes it a very challenging strategy is your ability to think of it as like get the complete defensive signature at a very low cost with all your cheapest stuff, and then start withering it away as you move up, that stack, that when given that perfect opportunity, a different shift is on that night, the C team that doesn't bat 100 or 1,000, I should say. Then you strike with the advanced, expensive multi-million-dollar, precision ballistic missiles, and then boom, you hit that complex, whatever that thing is. So that model is the new model, and the Ukrainians are fully developing it, and the Russians are developing their version of it. And that's a huge shift in this whole concept of the ballistic theater coming out of this conflict. So it's not drones the way we thought of drones a year or two ago. It's in some ways drones are becoming almost a version of very low cost, smart ballistic elements as part of a much bigger strategy. So I know we went over by 8 minutes, Richard, but you want to close us out, or any other questions or anything?
Thank you so much, Aaron, for putting all these slides together and for really helping us with all these questions in this update.
Sure.
So, yeah, thank you everybody also for coming. We had a really fun time today.
Great, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, and hopefully you got a lot out of this. We really like the Q&A process, and your feedback would be great. And then everyone let us know next time we want to do this, and I appreciate it. Once again, thank you, Richard, for awesome moderation, and great job.
My pleasure. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Everyone. Thanks. Bye.
All right. Bye.